All right, I wanted to do a quick video today. It's another Yuan Galt day. He is still failing to debate me on any of this stuff. He just declares that I am a layman and I don't understand court cases. I'm picking and choosing court cases that have nothing to do with what I'm talking about. And, you know, maybe he's right. It's very suspicious that he has time to argue about sovereign citizen shit and talk to, you know, Yusufel, who is another blowhard, but he doesn't have time to actually talk about this with me. He's only after the low-hanging fruit. But we're going to pretend, for the sake of this conversation, that Yuan Galt is correct, and I'm just going to pick one example here because I think I've got a really good example of why Yuan Galt is wrong, but he won't actually engage with any of this stuff. He just wants to do YouTube comments. So let's take a look at this. So in 3401C, we have a definition of employee. Now, I want to start off with Yuan Galt's statement. Yuan Galt says that all of the courts have ruled that all of these arguments are frivolous, and period. They've not offered any actual evidence to show why they're frivolous. They're just declaring everything is frivolous. And he has given me court cases, and he keeps telling me that he's given me court cases to prove that what I'm saying is wrong, but he's given me court cases to discuss words that don't have specific definitions. He's not given me any court cases that have specific definitions where the court ruled that you're not to use the defined definition. You're supposed to use whatever the court decides to use. Not one single case have I ever seen or has Yuan Galt actually given me on that substance. So him claiming that he's given me all these cases and that I'm a layman and I don't know how to read anything, it really doesn't have any substance to it. So what he claims here is that this definition, we're going to take a look at this term again. It says the term employee includes every individual performing services if the relationship between him and the person for whom he performs such services is the legal relationship of an employer and employee. Now, the first thing I want to point out is this is specifying the legal relationship, not the commonly understood definition or understanding of this, but the legal relationship of these terms. So we need to understand what employee and employer are legally as defined in the code in order to understand what we're actually talking about. Now, Yuan Galt says that the employee includes, when it uses the word includes, in just a second, it says the term includes officers and employees, whether elected or appointed, of the United States. And then it goes on to list territories, but every single thing listed here is a federal territory, everything. And so when it says the term includes officers and employees, Yuan Galt's interpretation of this is that it includes everybody. Every private citizen working for a private company, it includes everybody that is an employee and working for an employer. Despite the fact that this actually says the legal relationship of these things, not what we would understand, that's what it says. Now, I want you to remember this. This is in 3401, okay? Now, the IRS has the ability to levy. If you don't pay the taxes, the IRS has the ability to levy against your payroll to collect the taxes that you may not have paid. Okay, they do have this ability, and it is found in section 6331. And I want to take a look at 6331 because it has some suspicious things in it. All right, so the first thing is, let's look at what it says to begin with. It says if any person liable to pay. It doesn't say if any person making income doesn't pay. It says if any in fact, literally, it should just say if any person neglects to pay. But this says any person liable to pay any tax neglects or refuses to pay the same within 10 days after notice and demand. So they have to send you a notice and demand. And if you haven't paid it within 10 days after that, it shall be lawful for the secretary to collect such tax and such further sum as shall be sufficient to cover the expenses of a levy by levy upon. So they have the ability to levy upon all property and rights to property, except such property as is exempt under section 6334 belonging to such person, the person that's subject to this tax, or on which there is a lien provided in this chapter for the payment of the tax. Now, this clearly says that they can put a levy against anybody they want to, or does it? So let's keep going. So this is the first sentence. The second sentence reads, levy may be made upon the accrued salary or wages of any officer, employee, or elected official of the United States, the District of Columbia, or any agency and instrumentality of the United States or the District of Columbia, by serving a notice on levy on the employer as defined in 3401D of such officer, employee, or elected officials. There's a lot of stuff to talk about here. First off, isn't it suspicious that the list that they provide here does not use the word includes, and it is the exact same list that they just talked about in 3401, okay? So we now have two code sections that use the exact same list to describe what an employee is, and one has the word includes in it, but doesn't include anything different. It just has the same list. But the second one doesn't use the word include. It only says these people, okay? So we have two things. You could argue they're unrelated. One's in 6331 and the other one is in 3401, except that it does actually literally point you back to section 3401. So it points you back to the section that we're looking at up here, 3401 employee, and this is your levy, and it points you back to 3401 for the employer. So they're the same code section. So we have two definitions. One uses the word includes, one doesn't use the word includes. The exact same definition of employee exists in both places, and they point at each other, or at least 6331 points back to the original definition of employee, which again doesn't use the word includes. So now Yuan Galt would have me believe, and this is a problem that I have with Yuan Galt, is he's supposed to be a constitutional attorney. I don't know. He declares himself this. We really don't know much about him, but the problem is that we've seen cases. I mean, look at the abortion case. We've seen cases where the Supreme Court ruled a certain way and then years later had to overturn that ruling because they've discovered newly discovered information that has made the original case unconstitutional. It doesn't hold water once they actually start looking at what is being said. So to say, and this is Juan's point of view, is that I'm a layman and he's provided these court cases and therefore that's the fact. Well, if that's true, then there should never be an example of any Supreme Court case or any lower court case that has ever been overturned. It shouldn't exist because the judges always have all the information up front and they never make a mistake. So obviously there's a reason to fight this, because this is pretty clear that these two definitions are talking about the exact same thing. They point at each other through the code, and one uses the word include, one doesn't. So how are you, Yuan Galt, or anyone else that wants to respond to this, how are you determining that this is just frivolous because the courts, and by the way, the courts haven't ruled on this specific point. They've ruled on other things, and they've never actually ruled on anything. They've just declared that argument is frivolous. That is not an answer, nor has it ever been an answer. It's just done to try to shut down any further cases. And the cool thing is that once a court case, once some dumbass judge makes that ruling, they then turn around and all the other Supreme Court justices or the other courts start to point back at that case, even though, again, he never had a discussion about this. He just declared that this is a frivolous argument. And they all start pointing to it, and then they all start pointing to each other and say, oh, there's tons of cases that have all ruled this as frivolous, and not one single one of them have ever actually discussed why that argument is frivolous. And it is also suspicious, to say the least, that all of these things that we're talking about all kind of seem to be only federal definitions. In fact, they literally are only federal definitions. The courts and people like Yuan Galt want to claim that they include the entire 50 states and all of the private industry and all the private citizens, and they ignore the fact that if that were true, there's tons of constitutional protections that are being violated by them requiring you to fill out a form, by requiring you to give them your personal information, by requiring you to bear witness against yourself. There's a lot of constitutional amendments, which are really the one thing that got me into this was, how is it that the IRS is making me violate my constitutional rights, and they'll put me in jail if I don't violate my constitutional rights? It seems very odd. But in reality, when you start looking at the code, it's very suspicious that every single piece of code that you look at all only deals with non-resident aliens and or someone that fills out a W-4 or a W-9, and it all seems to all be federally related. So there's two choices here. The definition that is in 7701(9) only deals with the District of Columbia, like it says. That's literally what it says. Or it includes the entire 50 states. Each one of these is easily determined, though. So if you were to say that it means the entire 50 states, then you are talking about non-resident aliens, because all the code is only looking at non-resident aliens, the W-4, the W-9. That's all they talk about when you're looking up those forms. If you're going to say that the United States is the entire country, well, then a non-resident alien is who? Who's an example of a non-resident alien? Because one, they're an alien, which means they're not a citizen of this country. And two, they're a non-resident, which means they don't live in the United States. Well, who the hell is that? Who are we talking about now? Like, who has to pay an income tax that doesn't reside in this country, and they're an alien. They're not a resident. They're not a citizen or a resident. Well, that's a little weird, isn't it? That means that our federal government can tax somebody in France. Seems a little odd. Well, now on the flip side, you look at my definition and you say, well, no, wait a minute. They define the United States as only being the District of Columbia, and therefore they must be saying that a non-resident alien is actually everybody from the 50 states. Well, that seems a little more reasonable. And then also, they are only paying tax on money that resides from within the United States. So the United States is defined as the District of Columbia. And therefore, the money, if I'm making money from the federal government, I have to pay a tax on that money. That seems a little bit more in line with what the tax code actually says. So it gets very frustrating when people like Yuan Galt, they have time to go argue with Yusuf El about stupid shit, but they refuse to actually get on a line and have a debate with me over what the code actually says in the IRS stuff. And Yuan Galt, claims that he was part of the original movement back in the day, and that he doesn't, he hates income tax. And if there was really a legitimate way to not pay income tax, then he would have already done it. And maybe that's true. I don't know. He won't get on the phone and actually have a conversation about it. He just wants to, put out all this bullshit about him giving me court cases that don't have anything to do with what we're discussing. And then he ignores these points that I'm making here about these definitions. He will not address. In fact, I want anybody that has time to go look at his comments to me. Not one single time has he actually addressed any of the points that I'm making. He just claims by default, you're wrong. I don't even know if he's actually read all of what I'm saying or listened to watched any of my videos. He just declares, bonk, 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 it's all wrong. You're wrong. The courts disagree with you, and every argument you're making, they have ruled is frivolous. Again, no example of what is frivolous. And it's, I covered a Supreme Court case the other day on them going into jurisdiction and all this other stuff. And it's very suspect that they spent a lot of time going through and explaining their position and how they are arriving at their opinion. Because, it is called an opinion, but they give you the justification that gets them to that opinion. But in the case of tax law, they absolutely never do that. They just declare something as frivolous, and it's kind of like saying that, anti-Semitism, anybody that disagrees with something that Israel's doing, that's anti-Semitic, or anything that you say that somebody disagrees, you're an anti-Semite. That's supposed to be the argument against whatever it is that you're putting forward. And I'm just frankly getting sick of the whole thing. Like Yuan Galt, if you have the gonads to just come and have a discussion, you could make me look stupid in front of everybody and take care of this all at once. You keep saying that you want to debate sovereign citizens or people that support sovereign citizens, but you won't debate me over similar things. Like it's very strange that you tell me that you don't have time to discuss things with me, but you do have time to go after fucking Yusuf L. that I don't even understand what your point is with Yusuf L. and these retards going to traffic court. Like that's the only thing you have time for, that, but you don't have time for a real debate about a real topic that affects every single citizen in the country. You just make declarations just like the court, and that's supposed to be the end of it because, hey, I'm a layman.